Okay, so I think we can start now. Thank you everyone for coming today. Today we have a special guest, which is Julia Barnett. It's my pleasure to present her. She's a PhD candidate at Northwestern University who works in the intersection of computer science and communication. And his research is focused on ethics and societal impacts of generative AI, especially in audio and creative domains, aiming to expose and mitigate harms such as appropriation, loss of agency, copyright risk, and opacity in algorithm systems. Today, she will share with us some insights onto how generative models can inadvertently cause social and cultural damage and what paths forward might look like. Please welcome Julia Barnett, and she's gonna give a presentation, and then as always, we're gonna have a questions round. So please, Julia Barnett.
Okay. Awesome. Everyone can see my screen? Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks, Roger, for setting this up. So excited to be here. It's really cool to meet everyone in person and hear about your guys' work as well. I'm also open to any questions that you would have during the presentation as well as after. Treating it pretty informally. I'll be going over a few studies and kind of a framework I see about how we can identify some harms and then move forward based on ways we think we can build models and build tools to help fight back against them and empower others and other researchers to mitigate these harms that we identify. So with that, I'm going to introduce my talk, which is Mapping, Measuring, and Managing the Harms of Generative Music. As David said, I'm from Northwestern University. My name is Julia Barnett. And yeah, let's get started. So delighted to be here. All right, so the main framework that I'm going to be going over today to kind of frame the studies that I'm going to show and propose some ways to mitigate some harms it's from the US National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's called the AI Risk Management Framework. And this is a cyclical framework that starts with mapping. So you're identifying and contextualizing some harms that are a result of some systems. Then you're measuring. So you're also producing some methodological tools and identifying ways and metrics that you can actually understand the ways that these harms are manifesting and understand the degree to which they're manifesting. Please come. And then also managing. So
is there any chance I can just move?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so sorry.
Please. Oh, sure.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Well, we know where.
And then managing, which is the third step. So you're actually going to introduce ways to empower people to mitigate against these harms and produce those tools that can actually see your methodology working in action. And this is a cyclical framework. So once you get to the manage step, you might also identify some more harms you didn't cover, and it goes on so forward and so forth. So the first study I'm going to present today, I'm going to do a closed loop of harms within generative music. I'm going to present a systematic literature review that I performed to identify some harms from generative music. Study 2 is the work that establishes a methodology, so identifying ways to actually target some harms and fight back against them. And then study 3 is where you build a tool where you can actually introduce this methodology to users and researchers that will be the ones that are fighting back on your behalf. So the first phase, this map phase, is, I don't know how to X out of that thing. Sorry. The first phase is the mapping phase. So this is a systematic literature review that I published at AIS, the Artificial Intelligence Ethics and Society Conference in 2023. And it falls squarely within the mapping phase. So we're contextualizing these harms. And this work looked at about 868 records. So went through every possible paper that ever mentioned generative audio or generative music or generative speech within the 5-year period leading up to 2023, which is when the study was conducted. And I screened all these papers, and I eventually landed at 171 full text articles that were somehow about generative music, generative sound, generative speech. And within that, I wanted to map the number of papers. Yeah, of course.
Sorry for the clarification.
Sure.
When you say generative music includes symbolic music notation, audio, anything that is related to music.
Yes, the filter criteria here was the title, abstract, or paper used the words generative music, generative sound, generative audio, generative speech. And then, so it was a really, really broad category in the beginning. And the reason that so many works were excluded is a lot of works in, say, computer vision or large language models will kind of just throw away a sentence like, oh, people are also doing work in generative music, but the papers themselves weren't actually about it. So then the final papers here did include symbolic music. It included like traditional commercial music like Suno, Nudio, those types of models. as well as like text to sound, text to music, anything that fell in the category where the output was music and they used some sort of generative model. Sorry, output was sound. So it could be speech, sounds, music, and the input was anything as long as it used a generative model. Yeah, please, any clarification questions, more than welcome at any time. So within these final papers in the corpus, they were slowly growing over the years. So you see a stark growth from 2018 to 2023. And it's important to keep in mind these are prorated numbers for 2023 since the study was finished in January. But you do see a strong growth leading from 2018 to 2023, but you don't see as strong of a growth with papers discussing a negative impact.
That's right.
Yeah, and I was being extremely generous in my definition of a negative impact as well. It could have been a dependent clause, like 1/2 of a sentence, where people even just threw away a sentence to say, oh, also this could be used for malicious purposes, or this could have some copyright implications. Probably the most generous that someone could be would maybe one paragraph in the discussion, or even an ethical standards statement after the conclusion, so in the appendix of the paper. But very often it was just one sentence and they briefly acknowledged it. But even so, very, very few papers are doing it. So then only 9% of any of the papers analyzed in these 171 full text articles mentioned any potential for negative impact. And within those harms, they covered a really broad base. So it was very rare that one paper was discussing all of these. It was usually one or two. But within music, we saw some harms such as loss of agency and authorship. So when people are using these generative models to create music, they don't feel like they're actually the creator of their music. They don't feel like a musician anymore. In the same vein, it could be creativity stifling, especially with these text to music models. Maybe you input, create me a jazzy tune, and then it's going to sound like elevator music or something that's not very relevant to what you wanted. A predominance of Western bias, since most of these models are trained on many thousands of hours of like either American or European or even South American music. We're really losing that Eastern context, especially traditional Eastern music. And then within the harms from uninformed creation, you see things like copyright infringement, cultural appropriation.
Sorry for complicating.
No, you're good.
So the case of loss of agency is in the particular case, the user has some agency.
Yes.
Yeah, so that means it has a minimum knowledge of music.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there isn't anything lost.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so this would be from anyone who identifies as any sort of musician that is losing their musical agency when using these models. Or you can even think of it from someone who thought they might have agency going in and then just feeling nothing. So it's a decrease in what you would expect or what you know with music. Then within speech, I think these harms are a bit more insidious and a bit more kind of scary. So that's why I like to focus on music, because I feel like I have a lot more power in that space. But within speech, you see things like fraud, and misinformation when it gets to higher levels of celebrities or politicians, security and privacy. So people could match your voice and then maybe do some sort of bank fraud, or even non-consensual use of biometric data. So things like people using your voice to authorize transactions or just impersonate you in some way. And then across all models, regardless of whether the domain was music or speech, we do see this energy consumption, so the climate change aspect, and then overuse of speaker data. And that would happen, say you're running a study with 5 people in your data set and you record a lot of, say, an hour for each person, and that becomes your data set, and they understand that, okay, I'm doing this for a research project. I got paid maybe 50 euros for my voice for a while, but then maybe that data set becomes open source, and then maybe Apple picks it up, and then maybe one of your research subjects becomes the next voice of Siri. And they just had no idea that the scale was going to get to that content. But because data sets in speech and audio are so fragmented, you really don't know where these things are going to go, and you don't know where different commercial uses are going to pick up voices. But this is a lot of harms, and this is a lot to focus on. So to actually address these harms, you can't do it all. You have to focus on 1 or 2 harms that are related, that you think you can have a tractable way to address them, and then address those harms with your own tools and your own projects, and try to focus on something you can have an impact on. So again, looking at this, it's just a few too many harms. So let's narrow down a bit. Let's look specifically within music, and let's look at these 2 harms, copyright infringement and cultural appropriation, which are a direct result of uninformed creation. The only ways that these are resulting from generative models is because the user has no idea where the data is coming from.
But is copyright a harm?
It's a harm on the musician whose data was infringed upon. So I'm not using necessarily the legal sense. I'm saying whenever you're using someone else's music or someone else's creative content without their knowledge and without their consent. So-
I think also you could actually understand it as a harm to the creator of the music, because if they infringe the copyright being unaware of it, they can actually experience consequences of it later on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is the harm on the user. If for instance, if you're thinking about like ChatGPT, professors always say, if you plagiarize using ChatGPT, you are the one that plagiarized. It doesn't matter that the model did it, you're putting your name on this work. So the same thing can result in music. So you release this on Spotify and you're an exact copy of an artist who had no idea. That's still your fault. Like maybe the model enabled you to do that copyright infringement, but you're still the one putting your name on it.
But the infringement of the law doesn't imply there is harm.
Correct. Yeah, this is more of a legal term that covers a harm that is non-legal. We're talking about more the harm on the creator of the original music, which is not the legal term, it's just the misuse of their music. But then also in terms of you're unknowing creating, you just don't know if you're doing this. This is an argument I'm going to make about one of the main differences from generative music and actual musicians is musicians sample all the time, right? This has been going on for decades, for centuries even. Every artist is drawing inspiration from somewhere. Even if we look back at Beethoven, he will cite his sources in his own work, which is Johann Sebastian Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and then also folk music from the 1790s, Rhineland dance rhythms. And then we know this because we can look it up. He's a very famous figure. He has always cited his own sources, his own inspirations, and you can trace back the influences of his work. The same thing you can see with Rihanna, who is the most published digital artist of all time. Because we've now moved to streaming, I don't think she'll ever have that title stripped away from her. And then she cites her own sources as being Madonna, Mariah Carey, Bob Marley, different reggae artists, hip hop, Caribbean roots. And we know her sources because she's very open about it. She knows her own sources. She knows where she draws inspiration from, and it's never unclear. And she's not stealing from these artists. She's taking inspiration and then building upon it. But now we look at a generative audio model, and the sources are coming out of this black box. It's really hard to know where. You look at different generative models such as Barnett, which was trained on 800,000 songs. Music LM was trained on like 300,000 hours of songs. Jukebox was trained on 1 million songs. It's all sorts of things going on, and it's really hard to expose what those influences are if you don't know where the music is coming from. And maybe it's not all that diverse. Maybe instead of all those hundreds of thousands of songs, you're only training on one artist or one genre or drum beats. And so you kind of know where it's coming from, but it's still kind of this unclear, murky, where is the output coming from? Or maybe it is trained on a lot of different genres and a lot of different artists, but there end up being a solo set of few that becomes really influential on the outputs. All this to say is we don't know where the music is coming from without some sort of attribution influence, without some sort of way to expose this information to the end user. So this model is obscuring where the outputs are coming from, and we need to find a way to attribute that influence so we can understand, both as users and creators of the models, that we're not ignorantly appropriating, even if it's not intentional, that we can actually have this informed creation and know what's coming out of it. So that brings us to the second set within this map, measure, and manage. We've mapped the harms, we've identified 2 that we think we can move forward with, and now we're moving on to the measure stage. So the second work is work that I presented at ISMIR in 2024, so not this past ISMIR, but the one before, establishing a methodology that identifies similar pieces of music from the training data that can become useful for training data attribution and understanding where your new pieces of audio are coming from. So the methodology we have was intended to be easily replicable. We didn't want to have the most perfectly accurate methodology that goes into having maybe different like spectrogram methods or different highly statistical methods. We wanted to create something that was embedding based because we wanted it to be really easy for different creators, different model creators to implement on their own models. And our theory is that the easier your methodology is, the more likely someone is to implement it who doesn't have any incentive to do anything beyond just get their paycheck and create a model and get out the door. So within this methodology, we validated it in a human listening study. I mean, I'm sure I don't have to convince you all that music and sound is a particularly hard domain to convince people it works, because with images and text, you can say, here, look, it's my output, it works. But in audio, if they're not listening to every sample you have, it's a little bit harder to convince people. So human listener studies are really important in generative music because you can convince people this random assortment of human beings validated it, they say we agree. We explored it against various robustness tests such as pitch shift or time stretch, and just adding some noise on these music to see how it would affect in different traditional or typical attacks on music. And then we also utilize CLAP and CLMR embeddings, contrastive language audio pre-training, and contrastive learning and musical representations, which at the time and still today are two pretty highly used embedding approaches. So people are familiar with them, and it wouldn't be that hard to convert any raw audio into them. It's a very, very straightforward pipeline to convert raw audio into these embeddings. And then we also did similarity across localized chunks. So we're borrowing this approach from Samapali et al., which did it in the vision space. So the concept here is that this cat in these 4 photos, it's still the cat. But if you're going to train the embedding on the entire image, it's going to be a completely different image. But it's still substantially similar because you're still using this exact image. So we want to do the same thing in music, where you look at small segments of music. So you don't have to copy the exact song, but rather a 3-second clip or a 10-second clip, whatever you're interested in for substantial similarity. So we're comparing similarity of small segments, but looking across whole songs to see if there's any individual similar audio in that. So we're using the split product approach from Samapali et al. Again, we're breaking this feature vector into localized chunks, and that just means whatever your second embedding is going to be. We use 3 seconds in this work because that worked best for CLAP and CLMR. And then we performed a case study on BMAT, which I'm actually going to get into later a little bit as well, which is a music-to-music generation model trained on almost 800,000 songs that a member of my lab, Ugo, put together. And the goal of BMAT was to make music-to-music rather than text-to-music, which was the traditionally big one at the time. The goal of this was that musicians don't typically think of music in terms, oh, create me a jazzy piece that belongs on the beach at nighttime. They think of it in terms of like, do-do-do-do-do-do, and then you can create that to make a new piece of music. So the goal of BMAT was to create something really different that still had influences from the previous work. So we thought it would be a really good case study for our work, since we know there's going to be influences from the prompt song, but also probably from elsewhere. So here is a audio demonstration, and on Zoom, please let me know if you can't hear this. So we're going to have this prompt song that's fed into BMAT. And then the generation from BMAT, which again, these are 10 seconds, but I've truncated a little bit for this presentation. So you have a little bit of a remix of the song, and those sounded pretty similar. And giving you this number completely out of context, the cosine similarity using CLMR embeddings was 0.748. And cosine similarity goes from -1 to +1. So this is pretty similar. It's not necessarily a jarringly similar. And when we listened to them ourselves, we thought, okay, yeah, I can see where the influence came from. It sounds pretty similar to me. But the question is, what are the most similar songs in the training data of BMAT to this generation? And so the number 1 most similar, we're going to listen to now. And the second most similar. So these 2 songs had much, much higher similarity scores than the input prompt song did. And traditionally, the only information the user has is what the prompt song sounds like and what their output song sounds like. And if they sound distinctly dissimilar to you, if they sound different enough, you would probably feel pretty comfortable using it for whatever your purposes are, because in your theory, you create an entirely new song using this novel approach. But then we can look at the actual training data and see, okay, more so than that prompt song, we have 2 songs in the training data that are really similar to your output song. So if you're thinking about where this influence is actually coming from, it's not the prompt song where the similarity is 0.748, but it's coming from those songs within the training data that are much more similar, at least quantitatively, and then validated by the human listener study to our output. And in fact, the most similar song in the training data is on average way more similar to something in our training data than it is our prompt song. On average, the similarity between the VAMP and the output of this model and your input song was around 1.16, whereas the number 1 most similar song was around 0.84. And again, these numbers are super out of context, which is why we have the human listening study. Yeah.
So that kind of makes sense, right? It reminds me of the sort of camera transfer models that you train on one set of data, and they only know how to make that kind of data, no matter what you put into it. So it makes sense that it's going to be more similar to something that the model was trained on than it is to your prompt, because the prompt could be anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree with you. But as researchers, this is very intuitive to us. But if you think of it from the standpoint of a user of the model, all they're seeing is their input song and their output song. This is all kind of under the works. They have no idea what those songs are more similar to their model. And when we're looking at these similarity scores, 0.84, 0.85, that's not necessarily something that's concerning. Like when you see something that's pretty similar to something in training data, that's actually the goal of the models, to create something kind of similar to your data, but definitely new. What becomes concerning is when this score gets really, really high, and maybe it's an exact copy or something substantially similar to something in the training data, and you would have no way of knowing that if all you knew was the input song, which traditionally might sound very different from the output. So this method enables training data attribution of generative music models. Great, we think we've solved it, but it's really only enabling this for model creators or extremely motivated independent auditors. And if the goal of our work is to solve the harm of uninformed creation, we still haven't gotten that far. We've allowed model creators that have access to the training data, the ability to code and the incentive to code and embed these audio files, or motivated independent auditors to maybe do a similarity assessment. But really, we don't have any ability to enable this for end users. So that brings us to the third stage, which is this managing stage and actually enabling people to use these tools. I'm going to show this new work that we just submitted to Kai. You input your song, you generate a song using BMAT. And then it outputs 3 most similar songs. You can click a YouTube link. Here, if it sounds too similar to you, click on a genre mapping tool, explore that genre, it's been flagged as. And you can listen to different songs. And yeah, so this is our new interface. We're calling it attribution, and this is empowered by the methodology we just showed. But instead of needing access to the entire training data and the ability to embed all these songs and know how to code and know how to do that, all you really need is access to our interface. You can generate a song using BMAT or upload your own song, and then using the embedded training data of BMAT, which was about 800,000 songs, you can see what the most similar songs in the training data are. This isn't a perfect match. Say if you were to generate something using Suno, we don't have access to Suno's training data. So it could be that you're generating something outside of our training data and inside Suno's. And obviously, if that were to be the case, it would be better to use this actually embedded with Suno's training data. But as researchers, you work with what you got, and we have our own training data set, and that's what we're using. And we hope it's sufficiently large, at least to get a learning case so you can find something similar to it. And then you can listen to these top 3 songs, listen to the genres, and kind of explore the music that you've made. And so at this managed step of the framework, we want to understand how having this access to training data attribution information can actually change user behavior. Because our theory is that it makes you more informed, it makes you understand when you're potentially copyright infringing, makes you understand when you're potentially appropriating on some culture you might not belong to. But that's just a theory. So the managing step is actually understanding how users engage with your tools. So we just submitted this to Kai, so hopefully I'm not ruining any anonymity with the reviews, but I figure it could be pretty easy to figure out it was us anyway. So our experimental design is we have 26 different participants across 3 groups of musicians, media makers, and music consumers. The idea here is these 3 types of groups will use this tool for different reasons. Musicians probably already have this extremely diverse and known repertoire of music. They can understand what genre something is without having to be told what it's classified as. But also they might not know the extremely niche song. So maybe they're trying to remix something they're using. They want to sample, but they don't know. They want to know exactly what they're sampling from. Media makers, on the other hand, might want to use generative music in their tool. So these are non-musician media makers. So people like podcasts or video makers or film editors who don't have a musician background, but might want to use music in their tools. But they also need to know where that music's coming from. And also music consumers, people who are just using these models for fun, using it for entertainment purposes, and want to maybe understand what the thing they're using is most similar to. So within our experimental design, we have 3 categories of songs. High songs were songs where they're probably examples of training data memorization. So that was the one I showed you in the demo. That song wasn't actually created using BMAT. It was actually a vamp from that song blended with an actual existing song from a jazz musician to show, like, sometimes when you create a piece of music, it might be extremely similar, if not an exact copy of something in the training data. Moderate, which is what commonly occurs in the wild. It's the example we showed earlier. You can see how these pieces of music are similar, but you're not actually going to confuse them from one another. So maybe you're going to learn about a new genre that you created or a new artist that sounds similar to what you created. And then also low similarity. So this is when the top 3 songs don't sound anything like the song created. And it was to assess blind faith in the tool to see if people would just automatically say, okay, well, the model says it's similar, so I believe it's similar. And also to understand if it would help people lose trust in the tool. So if someone creates something, they say, okay, those don't sound anything like it. Is it going to affect the way that they use this tool going forward, and maybe not trust it when it does say something is similar, that your ears would agree is similar. So our design is we had a control phase where you just did not get that 3rd column. You didn't have access to the attribution information. And then the post-dual phase where you're generating songs and you do have access to these 3 songs. And we did this all for the same people. So each person in our 26-person user set first saw 3 songs, 1 high, 1 moderate, 1 low within the control phase. And then they did it again, this time with access to songs from the training data. And they answered some questions about similar genres, similar artists, if they thought it was infringing, and so forth. So within our interface, we saw the degree to which people used outside resources to try to identify similar songs and similar genres went more than double up. All participants, before having access to the 3 songs from the similar 3 similar songs from the training data, they went from less than half of users even clicked on a YouTube link, even clicked on a genre exploration link, even though they were put right in front of them to use, to almost every single person clicking on something in the attribution information. So they went from not exploring to being extremely curious and extremely likely to explore. And then we saw changes in confidence and comfort level. So this is for all participants on the left, and then we have for musicians at the top, media makers in the middle, and music consumers at the bottom. So the first thing we're going to look at is the user's confidence in predicting, their confidence in assessing similar genres. So if they made a jazz song, we're saying, okay, what genre does that sound similar to you? A lot of people are saying, I don't know, I've never heard this genre, I don't know what it is. But then after having access to the tool, you're like, oh, this is electronic jazz, or this is 80s jazz, based on what the output said. And then the bars are for the 3 different types of songs we had. So we had high, moderate, and low similarity songs. And when the song was extremely similar to something in the training data that we showed them, people became way more confident in identifying it, because they say, okay, this sounds really similar to what I created and also similar to my ears. And I'm much more confident in what the model is telling me it is, both in terms of genre and artists. And then also we're going to look at these 3 comfort levels. So at the end of the survey, we asked them, how comfortable would you be releasing this on Spotify, using it in a podcast, and using it in like a YouTube vlog or a YouTube video? And consistently across the board, people became much less comfortable using it when they thought it sounded really similar to something in the training data. So people going forward, when they think they're making something with AI, they're like, okay, well, this is new. It's a new song I've made. I'm going to use it for whatever tool I want. But when we show them it's actually really similar to something a musician has created, they're much, much less comfortable using it for those purposes. And you see within musicians, they became extremely less comfortable across the board, except when it was really dissimilar. They're like, okay, I guess AI made something new there. I guess I would be comfortable using it. And media makers across the board had the highest differential. So they were the most influenced in changing behavior by access to this model. And musicians and music consumers went from really not really knowing anything pre the tool to when it was the high similarity song, having large differences, but then still not feeling comfortable if it was moderate or low, because their goal was really just entertainment. So they weren't really seeking to use it in a podcast or having really motivated uses for this. So their changes only really happened when it was, okay, well, that's an exact match. I know what I'm going to do going forward. And the media makers especially were talking a lot about like getting sued or having their comment sections blown up if they were using this exact similar song. So they were really motivated by others' perception of them rather than their own use of the music, which is what we saw the musicians and the music consumers being more likely to use. And then we did a thematic analysis on short interviews after these sessions. And across the board, people had a much higher preference for access to the tool with the 3 most similar songs for different reasons, really. People wanted to know where the data was coming from. Musicians just wanted everyone else to have access to the music. So they were a lot less likely to use these tools, not because they didn't want the attribution, because they really just didn't want to use generative music right now as it stands. They think generative music doesn't sound as good as human created music, which I am prone to agree with. And so they just like that if other people are using it, they have access to information. Video editors, they want to know where their information is coming from. And a lot of music consumers just thought it was really fun. They thought exploring those actual songs, exploring the genres was more fun than creating the music itself. And there were different emergent uses. The goal of this was to prevent uninformed creation, but people also were gathering insight into the types of sounds they liked. They were learning, okay, if I click this and then I explore in this way, I actually like those songs a lot more than the generative music, but I never would have found them without using this tool. And some people even said that they would use the songs, not the ones they created, but use the songs that were the most similar because they liked the vibe of the song, but they liked it more when it was an actual human creating it. So they said they would use this to create a song they kind of liked and then find an actual song that exists and then use that instead of the generative music. So in conclusion of this, like closing the loop on this map, measure, manage framework, you can assess the harms of technology and then identify a few tractable harms that you think you really have the power, the domain expertise, the technological expertise to tackle, and then figure out a way to do that with a methodology and a metric, and then launch it to users to see how it would actually work in the wild. And then repeat. So we found that musicians weren't very likely to use this tool for the reasons like uninformed creation and copyright infringement. So maybe we have to find a different way to create these tools for musicians. Like this is an ongoing process. And something I've realized with this is the first step is the hardest. So once you do something once, someone else is going to pick that up and hopefully improve upon it. Maybe they'll have a bigger budget than you, or they'll have more compute than you, or if someone in a different expertise than you that said, okay, your metric wasn't as great as the one I can build, so let me repeat your research with my better tactics. And so you're kind of just opening the door for people to do more complex problems with these cool ethical questions you're posing. And again, this is a really diverse suite of harms that is by no means exhaustive. It was what people were talking about in 2023. More have emerged now, especially things like labor displacement of different ways that we're displacing musicians or sound engineers. So you can focus on different harms and do different things with them. So for instance, if you wanted to focus on energy consumption and climate impact of these models, you can see things like Green MIR, which was an ISMIR paper a couple years ago that was looking at the climate impact of all the generative music models at ISMIR, which got, I think, nominated for best paper at ISMIR. So you can do different things with these motivated by these problems. And also even within music, maybe you don't want to look at copyright infringement and cultural appropriation, but the ones we were talking about earlier about loss of agency and authorship and creativity stifling, which is a result of removing the musician from the equation. So if you look at this question, you can result in things like VAMPnet, which is the case study that we performed is on VAMPnet, but I want to quickly research scraping. Okay, I just got back. Screen. So my friend, over the course of a couple months, I mean, the ethics of this can and should be debated, but scraped a lot of Spotify songs for research purposes and went across this site called Every Noise at Once. I'll show you. Okay, cool. Should be joining again.
Recording in progress.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Good.
And just turn on the video. Perfect.
Okay. Sorry, my computer. Oh, no, presentation. Okay. Back in, we can see, maybe. Okay. Or not. I guess we don't have to show those. But I was going to just talk briefly about some works that my friends have done in the lab, which are looking at removing musician from the equation. So BMAT, which is generation VMS acoustic token modeling. This was the generative model we discussed in this work, and we performed a case study on. But the goal of it is to put the musician back in place of the generative model. Because when you see a lot of these text-to-music models like Music LM, or even some of the more recent Adobe models or Meta models, it's very text-driven, and it's very much for users that aren't traditional musicians. And you even saw like the CEO of Suno saying, musicians get bored of making music. Like no one wants to make music anymore, which I think most people in this room can probably disagree with. Most musicians out there really disagree with, because the goal of making music is a process and it's a fun creative work and you get a lot of meaning from it. I don't think we want to remove the music creation process from our work. So VampNet looked at working to integrate the musician back into the process and actually have music to music, and you can remix your models and you actually use it as a live sound machine when you're performing. And then that work inspired another lab mate of mine, Patrick led, called The Rhythm in Anything, which was just at this previous ISMIR just a couple months ago. And it was using the architecture from VampNet to make one specifically for drum beats. So you can record yourself just doing the fill tap and then kind of decide the timbre output or the different type of drum beat output you want. And you can make a drum beat out of anything, even just your voice doing weird things or just tapping or beatboxing. And those are ways that you can integrate the musician into the process again, so you can respond to these harms that are removing the musician from the process. And I think if I get rid of the HTML and share, it should be better. Yeah, okay. So different harms require different solutions, like I was saying, and you can tackle tractable ideas that, there we go. So you can tackle tractable ideas. I know this is something a lot of people struggle with, especially VampNet was trained on scraped music, like we discussed. There are a lot of ethical issues inherent in that. But at the time, Google didn't see a better way to get enough data to create this model for musicians. So Google was going to try to focus on both the copyright infringement, cultural appropriation, and creating models that are meant for musicians as opposed to the non-musician creator. It wasn't going to work as well as just creating VampNet based on the data you knew how to acquire. So tackle your own tractable harms to create your own methods, and then hopefully people iterate on them and make better work in the future. Because even how we saw with the harms identified, VampNet created TRIA even better than that. There's not a lot of copyright infringement in TRIA because it's really just your own input, your own beatboxing, your own drum beats. And it's trained on a lot of publicly available data. So you can use that architecture to create something even more ethically sound, and you're already grounded in the ethical harm of creating models for musicians and then improve upon that with more ethically sourced music. And something a friend of mine, Chris Donahue, recently said is these harms and these works often result in technical and complex tasks. Like data attribution isn't a straightforward task. Identifying generative music isn't necessarily a straightforward task. These kind of complex computer science, complex machine learning problems, which will attract really good talent in machine learning and computer science that is traditionally geared towards maybe making the next generative music model. But if you present these harms as really complex and difficult tasks, they are much more likely to kind of take them on. So these aren't straightforward things, and they're actually really interesting problems. And if you can frame them that way, more people will hopefully take them on. So I could probably show you the demo if we try a little bit differently with the HDMI, but before we hopefully don't crash my computer again, we can go into some questions about this work. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. These are my collaborators in this work, Ugo, Patrick, Brian, and my advisor, Nick. But yeah, open the floor to any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, does anyone have a question? Any comment?
Well, I can go. That's interesting. I have a question about, well, I have a couple of questions actually, but I will start with the main one that I get thrown. And I think this is something that David also pointed to. Does the harm and the infringement equal harm? And I feel like this work, like many others, take like this assumption that copyright infringement is a harm, and that we should side with like the big copyright owners, and that's the only kind of perspective that the machine learning, the music technology community can take. But at the same time, and I think it's also somehow related to like the statement that's proposed at some point, we cannot tackle all the problems at one time. So we focus on like a smaller subset. And you mentioned the copyright harm, but on the same list you had like the creative stifling and loss of agency and so on. I just wonder if like, what do you think about this perspective that actually like overprotective execution of the copyright protection can lead to, this other pretty big harms and risks, stifling the creative freedom, the right to sample and so on. And then also leading to, I mean, who does it predominantly actually serve to develop this kind of methods to identify that something was sampled or is similar? Because very often actually, as it was actually, I think, in the history of like the copyright infringement law, I think this is like pretty well known that there are these big corporations that can kind of claim that this is sampled, or I mean, when it comes to music, sometimes it's not so clear, no? It's more about who's got like more power, who's got like better lawyers, who's got like better methods to prove actually.
Yeah.
So aren't we potentially actually feeding into this like imbalance of power by taking this perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. Another field of my research is in like the intersection of generative modeling and copyright infringement. And we're at a really tricky place in history because traditionally all these copyright battles have been a battle between these big corporations that hold the copyright over a lot of these smaller artists and the battle for technological innovation. And this is kind of the first point in history where weirdly, both the big corporation copyright holders and musicians are on the same side. They're not necessarily fighting the same battles. Like you see the people that are suing Suno and Udio, it's not a small musician, right? It's like Universal Music Group, it's Sony Universal, it's people that are holding the rights to these music groups. Yeah, and it's a lot of different plaintiffs, but they are a lot bigger than just like your small local musicians. So when you frame this from a legal perspective, you're not really protecting the artists. And I'm hesitant to use copyright infringement as the definition of the harm because I think it's less so about like this legal and this economic right to the copyright of the work, because we want to preserve the ability to sample and we want to preserve like musical creativity. But I think the big difference between what that traditionally has been, like our right to use other people's work to create creative work, is you're not knowing where it's coming from. So I would like to frame this more, instead of from the copyright infringement perspective, more just awareness of the music you're using. Because like sampling artists have been around forever, for centuries. Ever since music has been created, people have been iterating upon each other's work, and that's a practice we want to encourage. But if you're sampling someone's work and you have no idea and you can't cite it, that's not good for you as a creator, and it's not good for the person that you're sampling So I don't think we should frame this as like giving copyright or giving royalties to someone based on this tactic, but actually understanding where your music is coming from. And especially from a user perspective, so someone that's using these models that isn't traditionally been a musician, doesn't know the norms of the practice of how you attribute influence to different artists or different songs, but rather someone who just thinks they made something new at the click of a button, puts it on Spotify, directly competing with the people whose work was trained upon, and you have no idea. So it's giving people a good faith attempt to say, okay, now you can know where this music is coming from, do with that what you will. Don't like allow someone to sue on your behalf, but maybe makes it a little bit more so it sounds different enough from that work, or you can actually then pay back and go listen to that artist or learn about it in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. No, I mean, I do recognize that there's also like the good applications of this. I just like, we talk about like the risks, and like you started with like we don't mention certain risks, and I think you didn't mention this risk, or like it did not like come clear. I think that actually there is this other side that I think is very underrepresented in this discussion.
Yeah.
Even when we're talking about the risks, we're actually not talking about specific risks that are maybe pertain to like groups that are like underrepresented in the research.
And university studios are protecting a business model, not the musicians.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of that in this topic, right?
Yeah, and you even see like some startups forming that are the way that they are funded, like they're assessing these problems. They're trying to do like music identification, generative music identification, copyright infringement claims. The people that are funding them are the big like record labels. So the money is not coming from the people you're wanting to protect. But I think in this case, more so in the past when it comes to copyright infringement, we're trying to fight for the same thing that the record labels are, but for different reasons and different economic reasons specifically. But yeah, that was phenomenal.
We have a question, and I think for the presentation, interesting. I am happy to see some of the friends in the presentation. And talking about the users of the AI platforms that generate music, so we can maybe say that you have the listeners, consumers, we can say musicians that are trying to use AI tools to maybe explore other ways of creating music, hobbyists, just hobby, something fun, companies that use AI music for commercial purposes. We have content creators like YouTubers that they need free music to just complete the content. So then what is the focus in the moment that we want to prevent harm on those users? They are very different. So that part was not quite clear to me.
Yeah, that was the goal of our user study, was to understand what different user groups would do with this information. And I think there are different harms from different types of user groups interacting with this.
Sure.
And I saw within the media makers specifically, a lot of them are either using generative music, but don't really know what to do with it. And they know that they're operating in this kind of legal gray area. And they're like, okay, well, sometimes we use generative music, but only when it's really the background. Or they'll say like, we have a budget for this film, but we only have like an extremely small percentage of that going towards music. So they want to use generative music either to identify sources quickly. The people that were using it in the most good faith would say, okay, well, I would use this to kind of get the type of music that I want for this creative element of this film or creative element of this podcast, but then grab one of the musicians that was most similar to it and then try to create something while actually attributing work to them. But I did see a lot of people seeing this as an entry point to using generative music. They were saying like, oh, I was unwilling to do it before because I didn't know the sources, but now that I can actually know them and cite them, I would be more willing to use it. But I think that does create its own harm because you are then, if you focus on the labor displacement, a lot of musicians, their primary income isn't from like their own music, releasing their own music. It's from doing these small gigs for different commercial purposes that will just pay the bills until they can focus on their own creative work. But I struggle between enabling companies to do that in a slightly more ethical way and enabling them to do it at all. And I recently have just been relying on, okay, this is the way it's going. People are going to do this regardless. So how can we do this in a way that will at least give notice back to musicians or give attribution in a way that they can be identified in some way? But yeah, I really struggle with that, and I feel it does perpetuate potentially some harms of commercial companies just using this anyway, but hopefully using it in a better way. And then, did I answer your question also?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a big topic.
Yeah. I also see Martin is raising his
I
hand.
think it's possible to answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I was aware of part of your work, but I realize that I missed some part of it. Especially, I like the part of the study with users and this tool that allows them to be aware of similarity of the music that they generate. This is something that we were with a couple of colleagues we were talking about a while ago, and I think it's could be even a useful tool when you are actually creating, not even with the generative AI, right? To be aware, you always have this nerdy musically friend that is aware of much more music than you are, and helps you identify the territory you're covering and other things that are similar to what you're doing. So I really like that part. And but I have a couple of questions. I want to know your perspective on a couple of things. First of all, I feel like this global, let's say, way of measuring similarity could be a little bit, I mean, not enough. For instance, if we listen to the example that you were using, the input example uses a bossa nova rhythm, right? And actually, the output of the generative model actually removed the rhythm, right? So it was an important feature of the music that was conditioned in the generation, but that was removed, right? So do you like envision a model like this kind in which, let's say, that similarity is measured or informed in a more like detailed way, with taking into account different dimensions of music similarity, let's say? I think that maybe this could be a way to move forward, like saying, well, the rhythm is similar, the melody is similar, and so on. Which brings me to the next question, which is like, there's this idea in attribution, in the discussion about attribution, of making the distinction. Now there's a paper from last week by Sony people, Fabio Monreale, and also Joan Serra is involved into that, which make the distinction of training time attribution and inference time attribution or provenance, right? So it's somehow related to an older idea that I remember from people from Google, like Douglas Eck, saying that attribution could be solved if we apply like RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation, right? And attributing to the using the RAG as a way of attributing, you understand?
Yeah.
So So this example that you show also make me think about that this distinction may fall short in some cases, right? Because actually it may depend a lot on what the model actually generates with this conditioning, and if I can use the conditioning as attribution, it's not so clear, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if it was clear enough, but I had these two comments.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Phenomenal point. We thought a lot about what type of attribution to use in our initial study. And our goal for the initial study, the end user wasn't actually the end user of the model, but the creator of the model. And oftentimes those are extremely busy people. They might be commercial more often than not. A lot of these big models come from industry people like Meta and Google. And there has been research done to show that people working in these spaces would love to do a more ethical approach as long as it's easy and as long as it's free. But if it costs them any money and if it takes any sort of effort that would go beyond their like 2-week sprint, they are just a lot less likely to do it. So we wanted to do the easiest out of the box approach, which is why we went with embeddings approach. I by no means am selling an embeddings approach as the best form of attribution. Like you're saying, I think if you can extrapolate maybe melodic similarity or timbral similarity or like rhythm specifically, or identify items that are specific to different genres and kind of computationally map those back onto the songs rather than just the way we were doing it, which is just kind of you're listening and you're looking in the map and you're looking at how music has been classified as similar to each other by different models, not your own piece, would be awesome. And the beauty of this interface is we can decide which songs to show for different reasons. So different things we were playing around with is what we are showing in the interface right now is clap embeddings, which is just global similarity of the raw audio. You can also do more melodic similarity to see like what is the most similar songs to your melody specifically, rhythm similarity, and this doesn't necessarily have to be embeddings-based approach. We're using it with a big vector database that has all these embeddings stored, which is why it's out of the box ready that way. But I think it would be much better if we have more accurate and more fine-tuned and discrete different similarities. So I fully agree with you there. We just wanted to do the thing we already had prepared is pretty much the main reason we went forward with these embeddings. But yeah, I think it will be much more rich and much more useful, especially musicians, because a lot of musicians said, okay, well, I just don't want the AI generated music. I like your tool, but I'm not going to use AI music anyway, so why would I use your tool? But maybe you can bring musicians in if you, instead of focusing on this as just understanding AI generated music, also understanding just your own inputs and your own sound outputs, if you have those more controllable functions. And then your second piece was more about how these, what was the second piece was more about the end user or?
It was of this. You already mentioned that you consider the distinction between training time and inference time attribution, and this idea of the RAG used for attribution. So yeah, I was wondering what's your take on this distinction?
Yeah, I think as far as I played around with different attribution techniques, they all produce something slightly different. But oftentimes to the human ear, you're like, okay, well, that's right too. So similarity in music is very amorphous and it can change. I think RAG is a really interesting way to do it. We're actually, one of the ways we looked at originally within the methodology work, the Exploring Musical Roots work, was in addition to these out-of-the-box embeddings approach, we used the Juke MIR approach, which is use the embeddings of the model itself at an inner layer. So I think it's like if you average the embeddings across layers like 8 through 10, just at the very center of the compression algorithm, it will give you a representation of how the model understands the music, not necessarily how any contrastive learning, different methods understand the music in a way that we have organized them, but how the model is computationally organizing them. So there are different, and that produced different outputs, also similar. So I think the RAG approach is a really interesting way to kind of grab from both the inference, like both the training point, so your whatever is being fed into the model, as well as your output, it can grab kind of the similarities and the differences as well, which I think is a different type of attribution to identify, okay, what parts of your song is coming from your input song, what parts of your song is coming from somewhere else. So I think the more tools you have, the better. And I think I haven't actually seen people use this RAG approach. I haven't seen the Sony paper you mentioned, it just came out. But I think if you can show that different approaches work better for different tasks, you should just expose all of them to the end user, because I think the more information you have, the better.
Yeah, thanks. I agree that if you remove the training from the equation, I think that we may be missing something, and and it could be regarded as a way. This kind of proposals could be regarded as a way of course, simplifying the problem a lot so that it can be trackable, let's say. But at the same time, it could be regarded as a way of saying, well, training data is not so important here, right? We are relying on the inference time provenance, and we are relying on this RAG approach. So the training data we use is not the main deal. And I don't know, maybe this is not. I agree that probably a combination of approaches could be the most useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would
Thank
also,
you.
the new Google Magento real-time model, I think also uses a more inference-based, like real-time creation. And I think in that way, the RAG approach would probably work a lot better than looking at the training data as a large data pool.
Yeah, I guess they use the RAG approach because people from Google were like mentioning it for very often in lately. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, if no one else have any other question or comment, we can finish this. And thank you, Julia.
Sorry, actually, I did have a question.
Sure,
Sorry. Well, thank you, Julia, for the presentation. Well, as you know, I'm really familiar with your work, and I think we share a lot of points in common research-wise. So I really appreciate that you took the time to come and do the presentation. So thank you. But my question was more related to actually the Kai submission that you presented today. I was curious on this idea of presenting the generation and then giving the information to the user is super interesting. But what wasn't clear to me is, apart from the most similar cases in the training set that you're presenting the user, do the users see the values on like the embeddings that, or like the cosine similarity embeddings that you computed or not? Because I know that like these interpreting these numbers is not easy, and like seeing them out of context is also like, okay, what does this mean? And at least personally, I always defended this idea of you need to contextualize what the similarity is, because even if it's similar 0.7, for example, you need to know the relation towards the other type of songs, or maybe the ones that are close by in the training set, even if we are talking of a training to generation a pair.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering about that, because then you mentioned this idea of the high, moderate, and low similarity, and I was wondering, how did you establish these categories?
Yeah. To answer the first question, we did not give them any information. We didn't even give them an ordering. Like if you look here, the Ready Rudy, That Old Feeling, and Trains Things Blues, those were 1, 2, and 3 from the training data, but we didn't even tell them that. We just said these are the 3 most similar, because we figured if we gave them any sort of ordering, they would maybe just listen to the first one, and the goal was for them to learn and explore. So we didn't even give that much information. We obviously have the scores, like the 0.74 or whatever it would be, but we were going to add another round of testing where we showed half of the users the scores and half of the users not the scores. But just in our initial pilot study, we found people became so focused on those numbers, and they're like, well, what does this mean? And they have so many more questions that even just explanations of what they meant weren't enough for people. So we figured that if this was geared towards researchers, the scores would actually be really useful, which is why it's not quite open source, but we'll give anyone the code that wants this, but this is built within a digital audio workstation as well. So there we have the option to turn on the scores if people want that. But in terms of just hosting it for users, we removed all information that could possibly confuse people. But yeah, especially if you want to use it to identify how similar different things are, we have the option to turn on those labels. And for creating the high, moderate, and low, for the low, so within our vector database, we are able to return the top 10,000 most similar songs. That's the limit that it gives us. So for the low songs, we grabbed a few songs towards the bottom of that top 10,000. So it was kind of similar. Obviously, there are millions of embeddings in this database, so the top 10,000 are still quite similar relative to the rest of the music, but they're not going to sound that similar to your ear. So for the low songs, we just grabbed a few in the bottom of the top 10,000. For moderate, we just grabbed songs out of the box from Barnett. We got their actual creations and we made sure that they weren't the direct infringement. We made sure they weren't like the really, really high score. And then also listening to your ear, you wouldn't mistake them for the songs. And then for the high song, we grabbed the direct output of VampNet, and we got the most similar song in our training data from that input song, and we just blended them together. So we kind of overlaid the vamp on top of an actual song and made sure it was very clear to the user that you could hear an actual song. So the high was manually made, moderate directly out of the output, and low was just grabbed towards the bottom.
Sorry, quick question again. Can I use this model to check over 100,000 songs from Suno?
Yes, but it will only be against our training data. So our training data is not exhaustive. I mean, it's pretty large, but I have to imagine Suno is trained on much more than our smaller 800,000. So you could use it.
But with the confidence, I can be confident that some of the songs are actually there.
But it would probably be a lower bound, right?
Yeah.
So like if they're infringing on we know Suno's infringing on songs. Like we know Suno is copying things, but there are probably songs within Suno's training data that are outside of ours. So if they overlap, you will absolutely find them.
Yeah.
But if they don't, we might tell you it's really new and novel when in reality, we just don't have that song. Yeah, let's do it. And I know people are I know corporations at least are encouraging people to create songs using Suno, and then that becomes their training data set because it's legally, they don't have to pay rights to anyone. And then we get into homogenization of music. If all the music you're creating is based on generative music, it's a whole mess. Which is why I like that people are using this tool to just identify real people's
That's
music.
another harm, we can say.
Yes, exactly. Because no one was talking about it in 2023 because we hadn't really reached it yet. But then even the way you brought it up, like that is a huge one now, is that when people are using generative music as the training data, it's a whole other mess.
Nice.
But does that answer your question, Marsha?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Sorry about the technical